Okay, a quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. Now I'd like to recognize myself for an opening statement. Thank you guys for your patience. Today we meet to highlight a very important region in our hemisphere that unfortunately often gets overlooked. Many of our Caribbean friends have repeatedly urged the United States to pay more attention to the Caribbean, and I want you to know that I've heard you. I'd also like to thank Ranking Member Sears in particular for his leadership in working to prioritize this subcommittee's focus on the Caribbean. These islands, home to many beautiful and popular travel destinations, often come up in conversation for the average American only in the context of tourism and planning a future vacation. However, while these are certainly important strengths for the region, the Caribbean has much more to offer, which U.S. businesses, universities, local communities should consider when planning future investment, academic research, or where to develop stronger economic ties. One of the primary tools of U.S. engagement with CARICOM countries is the Caribbean Basin Initiative, or CBI, which was created in 1983. Can we turn that sound down a little bit, sir? Can we turn that down just a little bit? Okay. Which was created in 1983 and has subsequently expanded to provide 17 countries and dependent territories with duty-free access to the U.S. market for most goods. This engagement has led to a 44% increase in U.S. exports to the Caribbean over the past 10 years, and last year, the total trade relationship between the U.S. and the Caribbean was $33.4 billion. I believe it is critical to work with our neighbors to mutually promote economic growth through trade liberalization, respect for the rule of law, and adherence to free market principles in order to achieve prosperity that is sustainable for the region. In addition, I'm a firm supporter of deeper U.S.-Caribbean energy relations. To me, it's a win-win situation. U.S. possesses an abundance of oil, natural gas, and technical expertise, and the Caribbean has some of the highest energy costs in the world and needs to lower these costs by building infrastructure for delivering energy, integrating energy markets to attract investment and financing, and establish pipelines and liquefied natural gas frameworks. In view of Venezuela's instability, its oil production decline, and low global oil prices, countries in the Caribbean dependent on Venezuela's Petrocaribe programs should seriously consider how they can diversify their energy matrix and build stronger energy partnerships with the United States and other energy-producing countries in the region. After all, the United States is the largest energy producer in the Western Hemisphere, and collectively with Mexico and Canada, North America accounts for 71% of the hemisphere's crude oil and 28% of natural gas reserves in the hemisphere. Similarly, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Trinidad and Tobago have significant oil and natural gas production. In my view, freedom-loving, market-friendly, energy-producing countries in this hemisphere should be working more closely together to pursue hemispheric-wide energy independence, and that means assisting non-energy-producing countries, including the Caribbean neighbors, in reaching this objective. Ultimately, if the Western Hemisphere were more energy independent, it would go a long way to transforming our societies and security and independence and our economic growth. So today, there are many trade and energy opportunities for U.S. and CARICOM. However, I remain concerned about the growing security challenges in the region from transnational criminal organizations that seek to use the region to ship drugs, migrants, and contraband to United States shores. The Caribbean Basin Security Initiative is another tool the United States has used since 2010 to address regional security issues, and given the Caribbean's strategic location to the U.S. homeland, we need to keep considering ways to improve CBSI and more effectively cooperate with regional partners, control borders, block criminal groups' ability to exploit permissive environments to their advantage. I'm also concerned about the people from the Caribbean that have joined the Islamic extremist organization. Last year, the former head of the U.S. Southern Command, General Kelly, testified before Congress that close to 100 people had left the Caribbean to go fight in Syria. And subsequent briefing, he specifically named Jamaica, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago as having had people leave for the battlefield. These threats to the United States and regional security should motivate all of us, give us all a greater willingness to do more to strengthen security cooperation. Moreover, I want to point out that a previous subcommittee hearing on border security threats in the region, I raised concerns regarding reports that I had seen about citizen by investment programs in the Caribbean, which have enabled fraud, corruption, and exploitation by foreign nationals. I hope our Caribbean friends will consider the regional implications of poorly managed CIPs They pose security vulnerabilities to all of us, since improperly vetted CIP applicants might allow transnational criminal to evade sanctions and travel restrictions. In view of the growing security threats that I have mentioned, it is vital for regional security that Caribbean countries, as well as all Latin American countries, adopt and follow strong vetting mechanisms according to international best practices, using all checks of law enforcement, sanctions, and terrorist database that are available to them. And finally, I'd be remiss if I did not mention the importance the United States places on cooperation in the multilateral organizations such as the United Nations or the OAS, Organization of American States. I want to thank the Caribbean countries that voted with the United States recently at the OAS on the situation in Venezuela. I recognize your support and friendship, and I commend your courage of conviction to speak the truth to power even when it is difficult. These countries that chose to abstain from voting or voted against the resolution at the OAS regarding the situation in Venezuela, I want you to know that your decision only furthers oppression and tyranny in the Americas. It is my hope that you will reconsider how your vote on these type of issues in the future. Ultimately, we all have a responsibility to actively safeguard freedom in the Americas, but that can only require very tough choices. I realize these decisions are complex, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on all these topics today. And so with that, I'll turn to the ranking member for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for working together on this hearing, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Thank you very much. The Caribbean is often described as America's third water, and I agree with this description. With almost 45 million people encompassing 16 independent countries and 14 overseas territories, the Caribbean is a diverse region that includes some of the Hemisphere's richest and poorest nations. It is a region of great economic and cultural, political, and security ties to the United States. The U.S.-Caribbean relationship is characterized by extensive economic linkages, significant security cooperation, and continued U.S. assistance to support economic and social development, including efforts to combat HIV/AIDS and to mitigate the effects of climate change. Over the past 2 years, the administration has put forth a new effort supporting energy diversification and clean, sustainable energy projects to improve the region's energy security and to help it move away from its dependence on oil from Venezuela. Venezuela, which has long subsidized energy costs to many Latin American and Caribbean countries, must turn inward to rescue itself from economic and political collapse. Amidst these troubling times, we must work with our Caribbean partners to diversify energy sources, strengthen their economies, and build upon a mutual security interest. On the legislative front, last month the House approved H.R. 4939, the United States Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act of 2016. This act is designed to increase engagement with the Caribbean and require the Secretary of State to submit a multi-year plan to Congress for U.S. engagement with the Caribbean regions, an update on its U.S. diplomatic efforts to engage the Eastern Caribbean countries. As a global power, the United States faces challenges and threats from every corner of the world. However, it is vital that we remain engaged in the Western Hemisphere and not lose sight of our interests so close to home. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the U.S. efforts in the Caribbean can improve and how America can continue to strengthen its partnership with our Caribbean neighbors. Thank you.
I want to thank the ranking member, and I would just say I don't know how many other members we're going to have today. We have adjourned for the August recess break, and we wanted to continue knowing that we were going to adjourn today. We wanted to continue with this hearing because that's how important it is, the ranking member and myself. So don't think because no other members show up that it isn't a vital issue to the committee and to the subcommittee, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses who are very well known to the committee, so their bios are available to us, and I'll recognize Eric Farnsworth for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for continuing with the hearing on such a vital topic. Thank you for your leadership overall on these issues, as well as the Caribbean specifically, and Mr. Ranking Member, you as well. It's really important to have a bipartisan voice on these issues, and we note that. We take satisfaction in that, and thank you for that leadership, and we ask that that would continue in some way, given the importance of the issues at hand. The United States does have strategic issues in the Caribbean basin. We don't often talk about it in that way, but in my view, they are strategic, from support for democratic institutions, some of which are quite fragile, some are which are strong and enduring. We have security interests, including drug trafficking, counterterrorism, the fight against financial crimes, obviously immigration and humanitarian concerns, energy, the environment, economic development. It's a very wide range of issues to which the United States has interests. The United States also maintains significant diplomatic interests in the region, most notably in the current context related to Venezuela's slow-motion collapse and related discussions at the OAS and the United Nations, and both of you have referred to those issues as well. Recognizing this, the administration has made a number of efforts along these lines to improve relations with the Caribbean. Presidential and vice presidential travel has been well received, as have initiatives on security and energy. The Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, for example, has proven to be a workable concept, and in my view, enhanced results would be anticipated with the availability of greater resources for that program. At the same time, at least in this instance, geography really is destiny, and the hard reality is that the Caribbean lies between the major drug-producing region of the Andes and the overwhelming demand for drugs in North America and also in Europe. It has also been a jump-off point for extra-regional migration to the United States. Security is a constant challenge for regional law enforcement, requiring close coordination and assistance from the United States and other interested parties. Economically, the Caribbean Basin is also under strain. With generally small productive capacities, the region has relied on preferential trade access with the United States and Europe, robust tourism receipts, and most recently, Venezuelan energy largesse via Petrocaribe. With the reduction both in global energy prices and also Venezuelan production, Petrocaribe is less important now than it once was, but the program has nonetheless left a significant debt overhang for a number of Caribbean nations. Likewise, tourism is being impacted by new market entrants in the region, as well as the possibility of reduced demand from the United Kingdom in the wake of Brexit, and also health-related concerns such as the Zika virus, which we are hearing so much about. The Obama administration has sought to address several of these economic concerns by promoting the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative to catalyze a cleaner, more energy-secure future consistent with the Paris Climate Change Accords. Nonetheless, still greater progress might be made. I've thought for some time, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, that we need to think bigger and bolder and more strategically about the Caribbean, and this hearing is part of that process, and again, I thank you for doing it. In my judgment, and with the new expansion of the Panama Canal, it's time perhaps for a new Caribbean Basin initiative, which will bring a number of the policy priorities together under one strategic initiative. For this reason, I'm particularly pleased that the House has just passed the United States Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act, and Mr. Series, you referenced that in your opening comments. This is a worthy bipartisan effort to begin the process, and I urge prompt Senate passage of the bill. Several related initiatives might also be considered. Learning from successes like Costa Rica, for example, the Caribbean should consider branding itself the cleanest, most environmentally friendly region for tourists and citizens, which the United States can actively support. Not just technical assistance, but also concessionary financing, technology transfer, debt-for-nature swaps, and a regional commitment to open markets, perhaps through expanded trade and investment ties with the United States, particularly in natural gas exports, which would all be part of a new CBI designed in full consultation and coordination with Caribbean leaders themselves to rebrand the region as a model for environmental and clean energy development. Caribbean leaders, for their part, would be encouraged to strengthen regional integration and cooperation, reduce barriers to trade and investment, create efficiencies, particularly in clean energy-related sectors, including standards and regulations, and promote a regional vision, not just a national vision, for each individual nation. A focus on investment climate issues would also be welcome, as would mechanisms to ensure that de-risking by U.S. banks not unduly burden the Caribbean banking sector or reduce access to trade finance and development support, including remittances. Diplomatically, we could anticipate a favorable response from the region if the United States took a more proactive approach. Additional embassies and pre-clearance facilities, a commitment to ongoing high-level consultations, including visits, and the naming of a senior-level envoy for Caribbean Basin affairs could all be considered. In the meantime, recognizing the collective weight of Caribbean nations within the OAS and other international bodies should motivate the United States to look for quick dispersing deliverables which can be highlighted. One of these, in my view, should be a high-profile joint assault on Zika, including subsidized access to vaccines as soon as they can be developed and effectively deployed. Other nations, including China and Venezuela, are particularly good at these sorts of diplomatic initiatives. The goodwill they have engendered in the region through such activities should be a wake-up call for Washington that the Caribbean Basin cannot be taken for granted. In the current environment, the United States must contend for the Caribbean, as indeed we have to contend for all of Latin America, and I believe that additional U.S. efforts in the Caribbean would be rewarded. So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you again for the opportunity to join you. It's a privilege to do so, and I look forward to the questions you might have.
Thank you, Eric. Next witness, very well known in the committee as well. Sally Yearwood, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Series, thank you for holding this timely hearing on the U.S.-Caribbean Partnership. Coming as it does in the wake of the House passage of H.R. 4939, we have an important opportunity to assess and recalibrate the relationship. The Caribbean is the United States' third border. U.S. security interests and regional stability are intrinsically linked, and so, by extension, collaboration on critical economic, political, and social development issues must be a foreign policy priority. Today, there is no dominant partner in the region. Russia, China, Canada, Taiwan, Venezuela, and the European Union all have a substantial presence. The Islamic Development Bank has established significant ties for financing in some Caribbean nations, and other countries ranging from Qatar to Japan and Brazil have had a significant impact on how and where the countries of the Caribbean have turned to search for trade and financing alternatives. The United States remains the region's primary trading partner, but there is no doubt that when it comes to overall engagement, other countries are filling and in some cases exploiting a vacuum. What can be done to build this stronger partnerships? I will speak to the areas of economic cooperation that we believe could have an impact. Trade and assistance. The 1983 Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act remains one of the most generous non-reciprocal trade bills ever granted by the U.S. The Caribbean Basin remains a top 10 trading partner with a balance of trade surplus in favor of the U.S. It is also worth noting that the Caribbean is the only area of the world where U.S. ship operators and U.S. nationals remain significant players in the international carriage of goods by sea. When Sabero was passed, regional economies were very much oriented around agricultural and manufactured products. However, the world has changed. The economies today, with some exceptions, are largely dominated by travel and tourism, the financial services sector, and other service-based industries. At the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the United States Agency for International Development, there are substantial programs that are designed to build regional competitiveness. With H.R. 4939, the U.S. government can examine what exists, where there are gaps, and recommend potential areas for trade and cooperation which reflect today's reality. Correspondent banking and de-risking. While the technical issues behind this are under discussion among your colleagues in the Financial Services Committee, and recently they sent a letter to the OCC requesting clarity on the application of rules and compliance, this issue has been front and center for the countries of the Caribbean for a while. This is a global problem, but it is widely acknowledged that the Caribbean has been disproportionately affected because of the size of the markets and the perception of risk. CCA has been working with the region, the US government, international financial institutions, associations, and the private sector to help identify solutions for the Caribbean. The CEO of FIBA describes the situation as follows: "We are working on financial inclusion in developing countries, and de-risking is then blocking access to finance. This amounts to a de facto embargo on the region in the area of financial services." When international banks sever relationships with regional banks, there is a direct impact on economic growth, trade, and remittances. As important, when the costs of complying with regulations create a burden on the legitimate banks and they shut down, there is a threat that underground or less regulated institutions will take their place. This brings the issue into the territory of economic stability, viability, and ultimately security for the region and the United States. While we can all agree that the banking community's ability to combat money laundering and terrorist financing is a shared priority, what we cannot do is place undue burdens on any individual party. There exists an opportunity for all stakeholders to come together to craft a balanced, risk-based approach between regulation and inclusion, where all parties recognize that they have a role in the problem as well as in the solution. Travel and tourism. Millions of travelers move by air and sea between the Caribbean and the US every year. Air and sea ports are a critical part of the security apparatus every day. Sharing the security responsibility at the front lines gives the US additional control over its borders and creates a collaborative environment for managing terrorist watch lists, as well as trafficking of drugs, guns, and other contraband. Pre-clearance facilities in region are an instrument for building a security partnership. While the cost does not justify pre-clearance in every Caribbean country, a strategic look at increasing pre-clearance presence through a hub-and-spoke system would be beneficial to shared collaboration and security. Diplomatic presence. Representative Engel has long called for the establishment of a diplomatic presence in the countries of the Eastern Caribbean. There are 9 member states of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, 6 of which are independent. The OECS is a political and economic union that has proven effective and proactive. If there is no appetite for diplomatic presence in all of the countries of the Eastern Caribbean, I believe that there should at least be stronger recognition of the force that the OECS represents in the region, and at least one full embassy should be established there. Security and disaster resilience. CCA has run a disaster management workshop series with our partners from Tropical Shipping and other regional partners for almost 2 decades. This event underscores the importance of public-private partnerships in disaster management. Previously focused very much on natural disasters, we now look at broader threats to the specific countries. United States Southern Command is an important collaborator, and I would be remiss not to mention their ongoing engagement as well as their responsiveness to regional disasters whenever called upon. The region is vulnerable to a range of natural and other disasters, and resilience is critical. Any breakdown has trade, economic, and security implications for the broader region and for its partners outside the region. A multi-country strategy forged in collaboration with regional partners should be a part of the engagement. Time does not allow for the full range of matters to be addressed. Energy, for one, is a regional priority, and there I would urge continued U.S. engagement on the sustainable energy front, building on the Vice President's hallmark Caribbean Energy Security Initiative. Furthermore, Haiti remains an ongoing challenge, and the current political crisis has implications for the region as a whole. In conclusion, the United States and the Caribbean are natural allies, and today, with the uncertainty over the future of Venezuela and the added uncertainty about what Brexit means for the countries of the Commonwealth Caribbean, we can alleviate the insecurities that these small, vulnerable economies face when there is a disruption on the horizon. A quick look at the communique issued after the recent CARICOM Heads of Government meeting reflects the wide range of issues that the region is dealing with. HR 49 could not have come at a more strategically important time for the relationship. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Series, members of the committee, for the opportunity to be with you today. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Yearwood. We'll now enter in the question phase of it. We've got a lighting system in here. I don't know if we're going to use that with just the 3 of us here, and I think Representative Meeks is coming, but so we'll just try to get through it, and I'll try to monitor it. All eyes are on Venezuela right now, and Venezuela's impact on the Caribbean nations, from energy to trade and other things, are very concerning, especially Eastern Caribbean nations. So that's the question I have: is all 6 countries of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States are members of the Bolivarian Alliance known as ALBA, which includes efforts to promote regional cooperation and alleviate poverty. So to what extent have ALBA and PetroCaribe increased Venezuela's influence in the Caribbean? I think I can answer that question tremendously. What effect will it have with the waning influence of Venezuela, given the nature of the Maduro government and the issues with energy and the issues with poverty, and food security and that sort of thing? So, Eric, let's just delve into how Venezuela and the situation there is actually going to impact, especially the Eastern Caribbean ALBA countries.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I agree. It is the pregnant issue, if you will, of the region. Venezuela is a country that's in collapse. Economically, some are saying it's no longer a democracy. It's a country that has severe and lasting internal problems, which is going to take years to get beyond. And so the relationship that Venezuela has developed with a number of countries of the Caribbean in good times has become strained, because the largesse that Venezuela has been able to frankly give away or to provide on concessionary terms has been much constrained in the current environment. You talk to Caribbean leaders and they say, we're not big fans of the Venezuelan regime, but if they're giving us free stuff, why not take it? And I think that's, in some ways, it's very much a commercial relationship, or it has been a commercial relationship. I guess what I would say is, in the current environment, because of the troubles that Venezuela is having, and frankly because of the opportunities that we have in the United States through the entire revolution of energy that we've seen in our own country over the last several years, we have an opportunity to come into the Caribbean as a partner and say, look, the programs and the activities that you may have been doing with Venezuela are no longer relevant, and we can provide the same things that you need without the political, without the ideological overhang that you might have had previously.
Let me ask you something about that. Is there enough trust of the United States or for us to step into that void with those countries? And that's a question. I don't know the answer.
Well,
to that,
I think in the
really.
current environment, we need to do some groundwork. We need to do some spade work. I mean, look, Petrocaribe was a very successful program, and we understand why. I mean, it was timely. It provided something that the leaders needed when they needed it. It was symbolic. It was very, very easy to explain to people. I mean, we're getting oil from Venezuela. It was focused. It was on one issue. And I think sometimes when the United States engages with the countries of the Caribbean, we have a lot of well-meaning programs and wonderful ideas, but they're diluted, right? Not diluted, but diluted in terms of the effort and the focus. Under Petrocaribe, it was one product, easily explained, highly symbolic, and people said Venezuela's our friend. And I think what we need to do better from the United States perspective is to build that level of trust through an ongoing sustained engagement with the region so that people can say, look, we do trust you, we do take this partnership on the terms in which it's offered because it's mutually beneficial.
I personally think energy is a great opportunity for us, no doubt about that. Let me delve into money laundering and terrorism financing a little bit. There's a big push by the U.S. to have U.S. banks sever relationship with Caribbean-based banking institutions. Does that policy work to reduce money laundering and opportunities for terrorist organizations to access the financial system? And that's probably to Sally. So.
In a lot of ways, it does the opposite, because once U.S. banks move out of the region, what you've created, in fact, is a void, and that becomes filled by other institutions. And there are anecdotal accounts of people, when taking remittances between jurisdictions, have to carry that in cash in a suitcase. So what's being created is a situation where there's more opportunity for terrorist financing or something to go wrong and somebody to exploit that void. So I would say that the U.S. banks absolutely need to be a key and vital player in the regional money system.
Yeah. I'm probably less concerned, and maybe I shouldn't be, but less concerned about terrorism financing through the Caribbean financial institutions as I am about money laundering. I mean, we just saw in Panama a huge $800 million money laundering scheme, real estate involvement, huge number of employees involved, a legitimate business, still money laundering scheme. And so I want to make sure that we're cognizant of the possibility in the Caribbean nations as well.
Part of the issue is the perception of risk versus the reality of the risks. Banks are not leaving the Caribbean because there is money laundering. Banks are leaving the Caribbean because the costs of compliance are overwhelmingly stacked against the banking system. You've got small jurisdictions, and for every account that you're dealing with, you have to put a huge amount of money into making sure that the cost of that the business is clean. But what we have to do, in effect, is create a system where the regulators, the banks, everybody is working together, information is being shared, and when information is passed between the regulators and the Treasury, or the regulators and the banks, people know where the voids are. What we need to also do is see what the technology, the tools that are out there that can create better compliance, that can, the blockchain and other things that can build a more stable and more verifiable, transparent banking system. And the problem in the Caribbean is that the economies are small. Putting these systems in place costs a lot, but all the Caribbean will tell you that they meet the compliance regulations, and so there's a disconnect between what is actually happening and what people are saying is happening. I think one of the common complaints is the breakdown between what is going on in offshore financial services and what is going on in banking. And the Panama Papers were very largely linked to the offshore financial services industry versus the correspondent banking and de-risking issue that is currently being faced. And so that break needs to be made so we can tackle the problem at hand, which is the ability to move money back and forth in a clean, transparent manner.
I'm assuming the federal government is monitoring if the Panama Papers, individuals that were implicated in that start shifting financial resources around possibly the Caribbean nation. I'm assuming our Treasury and FBI are monitoring that. I would assume. So I'm gonna go ahead and yield to the ranking member.
One of the reasons that I supported, well, I still support the export of energy from this country is to offset the influence of Venezuela. Because basically they were using it for political purpose. You know, if you look at the votes that they took at the UN or even the OAS, you know, these people just became so dependent on Venezuela that we had to, I felt, offset that influence. So now Venezuela is in trouble. I think the reduction is something like 40, 50% less. And we have there's a void there that we can help fill. And, you know, we can really help in terms of just having a little bit of more influence on people. The other thing that worries me is that on the eastern part of the Caribbean, basically we have an embassy in Barbados, and it serves all those islands there. Meanwhile, you have Venezuela, Cuba, Brazil, they all have a presence there. So I was just wondering how much of a competitive disadvantage this puts us when we don't have really a presence in the Eastern Caribbean.
Well, Mr. Sierras, I think both of your points are very well made, and I would agree with both of them, the implications of both of them. You can't ask somebody for their vote and their support at an international institution if you haven't done anything to build that rapport in advance. And I think having diplomatic presence is part of that. And, you know, again, I go back to what I said earlier. PetroCaribe was a very successful program. Now, I wish that we had done PetroCaribe, not Venezuela. But now there's an opportunity to change that. But we see the results. And when the OAS, under a very courageous Secretary General, Luis Almagro, tries to bring the institution toward recognizing that Venezuela is no longer in compliance with the Inter-American Democratic Charter, he's not getting the full support of the Hemisphere, and indeed much of the Caribbean basin has not gone along with that. And if you line up the votes, who voted in favor and who abstained, you can do a pretty easy one-for-one comparison based on who's a member of PetroCaribe. And so the implication of your question, I think, is spot on. You know, and that's why I think when we talk about the Caribbean in Washington, oftentimes we think about it in the context of, you know, island nations or programs or social development, and all of these are very, very important issues. Venezuela looks at this as a strategic issue. And the dividends pay off down the road when Venezuela itself is in the spotlight of the international community. Then they have friends that they can rely on, and it pays dividends for them. So I think that at the end of the day, that's a lesson, frankly, that we can learn, and I think we can build toward reversing that course.
I agree 100% with Eric. Venezuela stepped in at a time that was very important for much of the region, and now the region is very much paying the price, whether it's in debt or other areas related to votes and other requirements that they do as a result of the
Increased cost in energy too now.
Sorry?
An increase in cost of energy also.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And so I think to the point, we are at an important juncture now with the cost of energy being what it is, with the US energy supply going up, and the region looking at ways to increase their sustainable energy, whether it's through liquid natural gas or getting the region less dependent on Petrocaribe and able to make these switches to new types of energy is going to make a huge difference.
See, I don't think things happen by accident. I think this was well calculated between Venezuela and Cuba. And, you know, unfortunately, well, we have an opportunity now to fill in a void. The other concern that I have is the significant increase of China in this region. You know, we seem to be put to a lull, a sleep or something, because everybody seems to move in and then we react. And we don't seem to catch these things until something like this happens, you know, like Venezuela. So unfortunately, you know, since I've been here, we've been pushing, and I know Mr. Meeks and the other members that are here, you know, this is an important region for us. It's an important region for America, and we really should concentrate. So now you have the Chinese moving in. They go through the Panama Canal, and they come in and they throw money, you know, at these small countries, which in reality they can't afford not to accept the money. So how much of an influence is there now of the Chinese? And I know it's growing, but.
The Chinese influence is actually very interesting to watch, the way China has kind of come into the region and the types of projects. Sometimes it's a sports stadium. I think the recent Bahamar debacle in the Bahamas. You've seen the Chinese government come in a way that the US businesses cannot come in to any country. If a Chinese developer comes into a country in the region, they've got the Chinese financing and the Chinese government behind them.
And the employees.
And the employees. And so you have effectively got a package that the US cannot, for Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and all sorts of other reasons, the US cannot compete in terms of the types of investment that they're able to take in without kind of having to do the due diligence behind it. And it's very welcome in a lot of places, but what Bahamar has shown us is that it can be very, that it can create a very difficult situation for the countries where they go.
I think Sally raises a really interesting and important point in this context. You know, the Chinese or Venezuelan model is a state-led model. So the capital of the country, the leaders in the country can say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to create Petrocaribe, or we're going to build a sports stadium, or we're going to declare that, you know, we're going to develop these projects. Whereas the US model is private sector-led model. And the disconnect here is that we're dealing with smaller economies, island nations, and in comparison of other investment opportunities in other countries in Latin America, much less worldwide, these are economies that generally aren't going to draw that large investment except in a couple sectors like tourism, like we've been talking about. And so there is a place, in my view, for the United States government to help leverage and facilitate private sector engagement in the Caribbean basin. But I think we have to be very intentional about it. We can't just assume that, okay, the private sector will show up or they won't based on market conditions and we'll be happy with that. I think that this is where the strategic emphasis comes in, to say, look, you know, during the 1980s we created the Caribbean Basin Initiative. It was a private sector led, right? But the government facilitated it. And that's been in large measure how we've handled or how we've worked in terms of Caribbean issues. I don't have any problem with that. I think that's appropriate. But we're competing against state-led competitors with a lot of money. And so this is some of the disconnect, and I think we have to recognize that and then develop the approach based on what the reality is so that we can be more effective in our approach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, now I'll go to Mr. Yoho from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you putting this together, and I want to thank you for putting the pivot on our neighbors in the Caribbean. As you have stated and that we have seen, and it's not just this administration, it's probably over the last 20 or 30 years where we've taken our eye off the ball in the Caribbean. When we have nation states that close to us with like cultures, you know, we value the same things, our family values, things like that, that close to us, and we take the eye off of that, we start losing our competitiveness, and we've seen that. I come from Florida, and we have over 105 million visitors a year in the tourist trade. And it's a gateway to the Caribbean, whether it's through our airports or through our shipping ports. And it is so important down in that area, and we want people, you know, number one is to be secure in that area. And with the conflicts going on in the world, we don't want them to invade in that area, and unfortunately we're starting to see that. And I think one of the biggest things is President Maduro, after Chavez, seeing what's going on in Venezuela. And we've seen in the past when you have self-appointed dictators that come to power, and when they fall, there's a vacuum filled. We've seen that around the world. We've seen it in the Middle East. And when that happens, you're never quite sure who's going to fill that void. And we want to make sure that we can have, I don't want to say an influence, but we want to, you know, promote the people with the ideals, the same values that we have, and help them succeed in that without being meddling into their societies. And it's just so important, especially with this time in our nation and around the world with the conflicts going on. You know, there's a collection of islands down there, nations, states, satellite countries, and like I said earlier, we share the same cultures, values in all, except maybe for that one sore thumb about 90 miles off our coast. And there's possibility of changing. And I think my questions are, with the energy for the Caribbean islands, if Venezuela collapses, which I know the oil production will still go on, it's going to hurt all the Caribbean nations. And so who would fill that void? Who would best be to fill that? And what I want you to think about, I'm a little bit jaded here. I think I would like to see an American company come in there and fill that void. How would you see that happening, and what would you recommend? We'll start with you, Ms. Yearwood.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. I think that the U.S. is well placed to fill the void in the event that Venezuela is no longer able to provide through the PetroCaribe program. I think the surplus natural gas, I think the growth of clean and renewable energy, the region is really at a crossroads in terms of transitioning to clean and renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind. But there are other areas. I mean, there are some of the, if I can make a couple of recommendations, one of the issues, for example, is OPEC has a large amount of investment in the Caribbean in the energy area. But there are two issues. The size of the markets in the smaller countries of the Caribbean don't necessarily enable them to receive OPEC financing or really be able to put together a good package for OPEC financing. And the second point is the lack of feasibility studies. OPEC doesn't make grants and it doesn't do feasibility studies. And so there's a lot of legwork that needs to be done in order to bring some of this new technology into the space.
Is there any private partnerships, private-public partnerships or NGOs that you would recommend that would be best suited, you know, with the oil companies and, you know, one of our think tanks up here?
I'd recommend Eric, no.
You gotta like that.
I mean, you know, doesn't get much better
Is
than
that a
that salad,
segue you
right?
want to?
Yeah, no,
you want,
keep
you,
going.
Record? No, I think there are a lot of entities in the U.S. that are working on energy in the Caribbean.
Okay, and I guess my concern is we can't worry about what happened in the past over the last 20 or 30 years. We can start from this point forward so that we have policies in place so that we have a strong foothold in there. And I know our feelings are we don't want to tell you how to live. We just want to be good trading partners with you, but help become strong trading partners where we develop an economic base in your countries. And with the influence of China, all my life China was kind of an adolescent, but in the last, say, 10 years, I've seen them grow into puberty, and they've got a lot of money, and they're starting to feel the effects of their testosterone. And we've seen that in the South China Sea, but we've seen the investments they've done in the Caribbean, you know, in the Bahamas, I think it was $3.5 billion, and what they've done in Panama and Honduras and all that. I don't want to deny anybody doing business. I just think there's better partners that we can have, and I think that would come from the good old US of A. And so policies that you would help direct us, you know, whether it's ag, energy, just merchandise trade, what would you recommend, Mr. Farnsworth?
Well, Mr. Yoho, thank you for the question, and let me make a quick footnote on the China issue first, if I can. You know, China's engagement in the Caribbean, and Ambassador Bernal is a true expert on this, so I don't want to step on your toes, but you know, it's different in the Caribbean than it is in South America, for example, where it's much more commercial, it's much more commodities-based. In the Caribbean, there is a very healthy political component because of the desire for China to be recognized globally, right? You still have the political competition with Taiwan in parts of the Caribbean and Central America, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to remember that part of the aspect as well. In terms of the energy relationship, one of the things we're learning from the reforms in Mexico is it's not just oil and gas drilling, for example. Everybody focuses on that in the majors and the deep water in the Gulf of Mexico and when's the next bid round and all that. But what it is even more impactful in Mexico is the power grid, the electricity, and when that gets freed up, the cost of electricity comes down, and that's really good for the consumer. And what we see in the Caribbean, across the Caribbean, is the cost of electricity is really, really high. And so if you can bring that cost down to the consumer, first of all, you have more disposable income to spend on other things, but also it becomes a much more competitive commercial platform to begin to produce. And so that begins to bring investment, which right now is more limited because, again, the size of the economy. So if there's one aspect that could really be focused on, you know, it's not let's, you know, continue to import dirty diesel fuel and some of the really dirty pollutants that, you know, Venezuela is providing. Let's help convert the Caribbean to a clean energy power grid that can be used much more efficiently, that where the cost of electricity can come down, and make the entire region a much more competitive, productive platform, which will help their economies long term. So energy isn't just then seen as an energy sector issue, it's seen as an economic issue, which I think is how we need to begin to view it.
And I appreciate it, and I'm out of time, but I look forward to working with you in the future so that
Sure.
we can draft legislation to help bolster the presence of America there, and I think everybody wins in that situation.
With pleasure.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We've been joined by Ambassador Bernal. Thanks for coming. Sorry about the D.C. traffic and probably exacerbated by the D.C. heat. But we're going to go ahead and recognize you for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies for being late. I left my house at 3 a.m. this morning. I was going well until the Falun Gong had a demonstration on Constitution Avenue. I'll very briefly summarize my verbal statement, which is that I think this is an important time for the U.S. to re-examine its policy towards the Caribbean and to take a new, bold initiative in the Caribbean, because the Caribbean has been having a very difficult time since the global economic crisis, a combination of long-term structural and institutional factors, as well as some short-term cyclical factors such as oil prices. It's important for the U.S. and for Jamaica because the U.S. is the main and largest trading partner and main source of investment and tourists. It's in the interest of the U.S. to have a prosperous, peaceful, and democratic Caribbean. In that regard, I focus on the economic issues because I think the economic issues impinge on all the other issues which are important, such as governance, democracy, anti-narcotics campaigns. I've identified 6 issues which I think need to be addressed. The first issue which I think needs to be addressed is the debt situation. The Caribbean countries have become some of the most highly indebted countries in the world. The levels of debt now for many countries have necessitated several restructuring exercises, and indeed the debt is now at a level where these countries cannot grow out of debt. Something has to be done. The debt is in 3 forms, and it's multilateral debt, bilateral debt, and commercial debt. It is time to take an initiative which significantly reduces the debt structure, which will free these economies to try to stimulate their own growth process. The multilateral debt needs to be stretched out and at a much lower interest rate. The bilateral debt can be dealt with a range of initiatives, from debt for environment swaps to cancellation. The commercial debt needs to be transferred over to the multilaterals. This will give some fiscal space and allow these countries to resume public investment and investment in health and education. Second issue is what I call international financial intermediation. The de-risking of the correspondent banking relationships are very important to the Caribbean because international financial banks have been critical not only the domestic economy, but in its link to the global economy. Some services have already been choked off, and there must be a way for us to find an initiative that combines the security goals, which we subscribe to, and also at the same time allow financial intermediation such as trade financing, transfers of profits, debt payments, etc. to continue. Thirdly, security. The small states of the Caribbean find it very difficult to contend with transnational crime linked to narcotics trafficking, international terrorism, cybersecurity, etc. The U.S. has done an outstanding job in supporting these countries, but I think there's room to do more in the interest of our mutual security. Security these days can only be defined as international and can only be responded to by cooperation among countries. Fourthly, in the trade area, there are some good legislation in place for trade. However, many of the Caribbean countries are now service-oriented countries, and we need to examine possibilities for promoting mutually beneficial value chains which combine U.S. and Caribbean in services such as healthcare, education, and back office support. I think by combining the skills and capital here with some of the human resources in the Caribbean, these firms can remain competitive both here and in the U.S. Climate change. The Caribbean countries are coastal societies. Infrastructure, economic activity, population, the built environment are all concentrated on a narrow strip on the coast, even for those countries which are not islands, for example, Belize and Guyana. It means that they're among the most vulnerable countries to climate change. More resources need to be made available in a more accessible way to mitigate climate change and to assist these countries in surviving. And I point particularly to the tourist industry, which is critically dependent on the quality of that immediate coastal strip. Finally, energy. The Caribbean, bar the exceptions of Trinidad and Tobago, depend heavily on importation of energy. It is time for the Caribbean to move towards alternative energy sources. Solar, wind, thermal all have possibilities. And to shift the production of electricity, which is among the highest cost in the world, onto LNG and less expensive sources. That will serve to revive a whole range of economic activity, including manufacturing. I conclude, Mr. Chairman, by saying that all of these are interrelated aspects that need to be addressed. If we could address them in one overall initiative led by the U.S. and involving the development financial institutions, I think that they reinforce each other, and it's time for a new bold initiative in U.S. policy towards the Caribbean. Thank you for allowing me to make this brief statement at this late stage in the proceedings.
Well, thank you so much for making the effort to be here. Mr. Meeks has agreed. We're going to skip over him and go to the former chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. Ross-Layton, for 5 minutes.
So very much, and I apologize for coming late, and we have another hearing, which I'm chairing on Syria. But thank you, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member Sears, for holding this important hearing. And I don't think that we can discuss U.S. foreign policy initiatives with the Caribbean without focusing on PDVSA and Petrocaribe. Venezuela established Petrocaribe in 2005 to help influence many countries in the hemisphere, and up to this point, this strategy has worked. However, now we see the collapse of the Venezuelan economy because of the incompetence of the Maduro regime. So it gives the U.S. an opportunity to fill that void. And this is where we need the State Department and Department of Energy to be extremely focused on this effort right now, because it is in our national security interest to coordinate an energy solution, a strategy, so that fewer countries in the Western Hemisphere would be dependent on a very unreliable Venezuela. And if we don't, and when, not if, Venezuela falls, because you see the writing on the wall, we mitigate the fall by not allowing other countries in the region to go down with the sinking ship. And I think that we've got to be working with our partners, our allies in the Caribbean, to help them take advantage of the abundant and cheap natural gas and the new advanced clean wind and solar technologies available. And this way, we strengthen our partners' economies, we buffer the region from the impacts of Venezuela's collapse, and take realistic steps toward reducing carbon emissions. So the crisis in Venezuela may cause an oil supply disruption. What impact would such a disruption have on the Caribbean nations?
My colleagues are determined to make sure I carry a fair share of the load. First of all, I'd like to recognize your long-standing interest in Caribbean affairs, and thank you for that. The relationship with Venezuela is a long and complicated one. Venezuela initiated the Petrocaribe at a time when many Caribbean countries were really very stretched financially and really needed some assistance. However, the relationship has its complexities. For example, Venezuela claims a very large share of Guyana, which is a member of the CARICOM group. It also has extended its claims in terms of coastal waters based on an island almost 400 miles away from Venezuelan mainland, so that the relationship is not all the Caribbean benefiting from some financial support. I think we're at a juncture where the relationship is going to become very unpredictable because nobody knows exactly what will happen in the Caribbean with Venezuela. But I think that this is time for a re-examination of the relationship. Several Caribbean countries are thinking beyond Petrocaribe because they don't assume that it will continue in its present form, and they have to be thinking of alternatives. This creates a juncture in which new initiatives, including from the U.S. in energy, would be very welcome in the region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Sears. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for taking time to run down here. Chair will now go to Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being here, and good to see all of you who, we rely upon very much with your expertise, and because the Caribbean is extremely important. I know it is to all of us in the United States of America. It is really, when you look at our hemisphere, we've got to make sure that we strengthen and working together. And I hear my colleagues in regards to especially Petrocaribe, but I think that the issues that are confronting a lot of the islands, and I noticed, for example, Mr. Ambassador, you listed as number 6 in order of priority, the energy crises, et cetera, and trying to make sure. So I want to try to find out, as it pertains to the islands themselves, the things that are most pressing with them that will help them overall with their economy. Because I know, for example, you can't just depend upon tourism, or you can't just depend upon, they have the diversification that needs to be there. And one of the things that I know we have worked on, and I don't know, and I'd like to get your assessment on the success of them. We've been doing a lot in regards to in trading. And what, let's talk, for example, in 2020 for Haiti, the HOPE Act expires. Is HOPE good? What do we need to do? How can we improve it? Will it help the situation in Haiti? Because Haiti is crucial, I think, also to the Caribbean. I don't know, and so that's important. The 2 preferential trade programs with reference to Caribbean imports, the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act. That's, where are we with that? Is that helpful? Do we need to do more? Do we need to relook at it? In some other parts of the country, of the world, we're looking at these trade agreements as a mechanism of economic benefits for both sides. So how do you see it, and how do you think that we can continue to improve extend or modify some of the trade agreements that we have with the Caribbean.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Thank you for your leadership on Caribbean issues. I'm going to tackle two issues here primarily, and I'll leave my colleagues to address some of the others. I think one of the key issues that the Caribbean has is competitiveness. And I think to make better use of U.S.-Caribbean trade agreements, a lot of the competitive issues need to be addressed. I'd mentioned in my testimony that the IDB, they're doing a lot of work on trade facilitation. That's going to be important to getting the Caribbean more able to kind of have single windows, reduce the costs of transportation, reduce the costs of clearance and moving goods. There are interregional issues as well. Issues such as traveling from one Caribbean island to the other can be more expensive than going to Miami and then going back down. So there are a lot of issues that the Caribbean needs to tackle in order to become a more competitive place to do business and to trade more effectively. I didn't want to however, not take the opportunity to say something about Haiti. I did live there for 13 years, and I do follow what's going on there very closely. And I think it's extremely critical that the HOPE bill not just go to 2020, but there has to be some sustainability to what is going to succeed the HOPE bill following 2020. Haiti's in a very difficult situation right now politically. Parliament is shaky, to say the least, kind of an interim president that may or may not be constitutional. I'm not a Haitian constitutional expert, but I have questions. At this point in time, what Haiti needs more than anything else, once this particular juncture of political difficulty is overcome, Haiti is going to need sustainability and stability to its relationship for trade and investment with the United States. So I think that's a critical issue that the Congress needs to keep its eye on. Thank you.
Ambassador.
If I could simply reinforce what Sally just said, the issue of competitiveness is real. And we deal with the business community all the time. And again, if we're dealing with smaller economies, which don't have as many prospects as some of the other opportunities for the international investor, folks are going to go elsewhere. And so there has to be, in my view, a singular attention to investment climate issues. Energy is part of that. It's certainly not the only aspect. I think we also have to be aware of unintended consequences, and you've done some really good work, obviously, on the trade agenda, Mr. Meeks. Clearly, the TPP is something that Council of the Americas supports. We appreciate your leadership and others of the subcommittee on that, but there are perhaps some unintended consequences, and for example, when the North America Free Trade Agreement was first passed, one of the strongest advocates for something that became known as NAFTA parity was Ambassador Richard Bernal of Jamaica, who came into the U.S. government, of which I was a member at the time, and said, we the Jamaicans, for example, support NAFTA, it's a good thing, but we want to make sure that Jamaica and the other Caribbean countries are not negatively impacted by the trade and investment diversion that might go to Mexico as a result of NAFTA. And I think that was a very important point then, and it's a very important point now. And to the extent that TPP goes forward, and again, I hope that it does, I strongly support it, and we hope that it's a near-term issue. Nonetheless, with some new entrants into textiles, for example, and agriculture that are highly competitive in the global environment, that will impact countries in the Caribbean Basin. It will impact Central American countries, some of the Northern Triangle countries where we're giving a lot of U.S. taxpayer assistance to, which we support. But again, the issue is one of trade and investment diversion. We have to be careful that in doing the quote-unquote right thing with other economies, we're not negatively impacting some economies which are already stressed. And so what's the answer here? I think the answer is to go back to the original idea in some way of NAFTA parity, only this is TPP parity, right? If Haiti, for example, is dependent on the textiles trade with the United States, we, I think, need to make sure that whatever we do in TPP doesn't unnecessarily undermine that, or doesn't create difficulties in a way that would take away some of those advantages that Congress has worked so hard over the years to develop. And it's not just Haiti, of course, but that's perhaps the best example. So my point is that if we look at these in a more comprehensive way, in a way that where you have a lot of different integration of different strands, then I think we'll come to a better place. And so as we're looking at these issues strategically, I just very much support the way that you're putting this in the context of it's not this issue or that issue or another issue, it's all of these together, and how can we move forward in a comprehensive, integrated manner in support of the Caribbean, and I think that's what we have to keep foremost in mind.
And because go ahead, sorry, Mr. Ambassador.
Let me begin by thanking you, Congressman Meeks, for your consistent leadership on Caribbean issues. In response to the issue that you raised, I believe that the onus is not only on the U.S., but it's on the Caribbean. We in the Caribbean have to do some things to make it easier for business to operate and to become internationally competitive. I remain convinced that if we create the right kind of environment between the U.S. and the Caribbean, that there is private sector initiative and investment, and there are opportunities, very real opportunities, which can take place by combining Caribbean and U.S. resources in a way beneficial both to the U.S. and to the Caribbean. In that regard, I think that we are focused a lot on trade in goods. That's going to be difficult for the Caribbean because of its energy imports and because of the small scale of production. So I think we now have to begin to think about services. After all, services is the fastest growing sector in the world economy. There are areas in which the U.S. could provide more services, and there are areas for collaboration where doing some of it in the Caribbean can allow U.S. firms to retain their international competitiveness against China, Asia, etc. And I think we now need to look at what is it we have to do to free services. For example, healthcare, retirement homes, tourism, higher education, all of those are potential growth sectors which are mutually beneficial. What the onus has to be is to find ways to clear and establish a seamless economic space between the U.S. and the Caribbean so that private sector capital can work. There are opportunities. Lastly, I would say that the Caribbean is becoming a much more complex area because of the changes in policy towards Cuba, the cross-cutting trade agreements such as CAFTA, etc. And we have to think of the Caribbean now in a wider sense. In regard to Haiti, I think very important is its continued integration with the English-speaking Caribbean, because these are well-established democracies, and it's an economic area which holds opportunities for Haiti. And there's now quite a lot of Caribbean investment going into Haiti, and vice versa. One very large investment in petroleum distribution in the Caribbean was from a Haitian firm. So I think it's very important for that Caribbean integration to continue to embrace Haiti, and that should be encouraged from the U.S. end as well.
Let me ask one last question, and that is, what has been the engagement or activity when you talk about some of the planning of folks, say, of some of the international banks like the IDB? Are they participating and they have ideas to help and finance some of the businesses there, or the IMF? Are they in, we know in Jamaica we had a big problem at the time when you talked about debt and trying to figure out what's the involvement of the international development banks in the Caribbean, and can or should the United States use some of its influence with some of the banks that it also makes contributions to?
I'll take the first shot on this one because I just finished a week ago 8 years on the board of directors of the Inter-American Development Bank. I can assure you that the Inter-American Development Bank in particular has been very active and has provided substantial support across a range of sectors. I believe that our big brother, the World Bank, has contributed, but I would venture to suggest that there's scope for much more resources to be put into the region. The issue here is that Caribbean is classified as middle-income developed countries and are therefore excluded from certain concessional facilities and are not necessarily seen as a priority when it comes to poverty alleviation. But while these are middle-income countries, the basis of their economies is fragile. Sometimes it's one sector, tourism. And therefore, while they're middle income, they're vulnerable and they need continued support. The U.S., I think, has a critical role in urging the development institutions to continue to play a role in the Caribbean.
Just a quick coda to that as well. We've talked a little bit about the debt overhang that affects the Caribbean, and so there is a potential future role, maybe not too far in the future, in terms of the international banks, perhaps the IMF as well, to really help work through some of those debt issues in a meaningful and lasting way. So there's a lot has already been done, as the ambassador was indicating, but I think there's an even greater role going forward that could be contemplated.
We've got time for a few more questions. I thought it was just going to be the ranking member and myself. I'm glad we had such active participation. I'm glad you showed up. Brazil is concerned about tourism with regard to the Olympics, and tourism being such a big part of the Caribbean nation's economy and a big part of the U.S. tourism headed there, Zika. It's got to be on their minds. I guess I'm concerned about how much U.S. assistance will make it to the Caribbean nations and whether Zika is even concerned of the island nations themselves and what effect that may have on tourism or expected effect. So if y'all could delve on that a little bit, because that's on my constituents' minds. Eric?
It's very much on the minds of the Hemisphere community. Referenced Brazil, and I think that's absolutely correct. Although in Brazil right now it's the winter, and the mosquito population in the winter tends to go down, and so at least we hear from the Olympic organizers that Zika won't be as much of an issue during this current time of the Olympics, et cetera. But look, Zika is an issue across the region and indeed here in the United States too. And that's why in my prepared comments, it seems to me that this could be an easy win for the United States, if we want to put it in those terms. Zika affects all of us. We all have a very real incentive to get rid of it as fast and as quickly and as comprehensively as possible. So there's a lot of good research going on in the United States and other places. Once the vaccine or the right approach to address Zika comes forward, why not, working with the Caribbean partners and others in the hemisphere, have a very significant public health initiative that affects people where they live. I mean, this is the type of thing, these are the types of lessons we're learning that are very effective from other countries when they do it, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's China, whether it's other countries, because this is what people need. And if the United States could be seen as helping to address a very relevant public health issue and do so in a cost-effective way in partnership with host governments, I think that's an obvious area to try to explore.
Thank you. The Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, Caribbean Tourism Organization, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, and the Pan American Health Organization are all intimately involved in trying to deal with the Zika crisis, not just at the global level, but also at the tourism level. People recognize Zika as a singular issue that could impact the economy of the entire region, and so they're very cognizant and working towards trying to contain the threats and dealing with the vector management, etc. I think to Eric's point, the ability of those agencies to have greater participation by the U.S. government, providing support, technical assistance, and working with CDC, getting additional resources into the fight could only be helpful.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll permit me, Zika is a problem in itself, but it raises a much broader issue, which is hemispheric and global pandemics. There are so many people moving around the region from the US, Canada, from the Caribbean, several million a year, that it is an interest of common and mutual importance that we try to combat these pandemics. Early intervention is critical. The moment we need to have a fast-acting reaction to the possibility of pandemics. We know, for example, that back in the 60s when there was an outbreak of polio in Jamaica, that for a relatively small amount of expenditure on preventative measures, vaccines, we could have prevented a major human tragedy. So one of the things we can look at is a fast reacting mechanism for possible pandemics. It's in our mutual interest. These are issues which are not national or even regional, they're global. And the only way to tackle them is by effective cooperation. In passing, let me say that the debt situation is such that it's beginning to constrain the governments in their ability to do health and education, which has long-term adverse consequences for development. If we could address the debt, and maybe one of the areas to look at is to bring in foundations and development agents to look at debt for health swaps, in which some of the debt can be alleviated and that money be put into preventative health care.
Thank you for that. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Haiti and Dominican Republic and ask them.
That's what I'm going to ask.
I'll let you ask the question if you'd like.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
I'm not going to ask the question.
So migration, economy, situation in Haiti with the government, if y'all just want to touch on that.
That's opening a rabbit hole, but there are a lot of possible ways to go at this question. Haiti is in a particularly interesting situation. As I mentioned, I was there for 13 years. I've been working on the issue for almost 20 years. And I think at this particular point in time is as bad as I've ever seen it in terms of the simple inability to know what's going to happen, in whether it's with the parliament or the government. Crime is on the rise. Budget-wise, we know the US and the European Union are not going to be providing money towards elections. Last I heard, there was no money in the Haitian budget for elections. So somehow they need to find 55 million to get to a set of elections that nobody's certain, if it can happen and if it will happen because of the impasse on the ground there. That, of course, has repercussions on the DR Haiti migration issue. If Haiti continues to slide downhill, it's going to be hard-pressed for anybody to be able to stop the flight of migrants, either to the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, Jamaica, and, of course, Florida and the United States. So I don't know if the question is how do we solve this, because I don't know, but but it is, I think, something that's just critical at this moment, and I think that the potential is there for this to go very bad very quickly.
I recognize the ranking member.
Oh, I have a question. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Cuba. You know, many of these island nations, their main source of income is tourism. We have this push now, and this to open up Cuba, lifting the travel embargo, and making it easier for Americans to travel to Cuba. Now, how much of a detriment is that going to be to the rest of the islands? Because Cuba has always been seen as the place to go in the Caribbean. And I think that that is going to hurt the economy of a lot of these islands. First of all, it's 90 miles from Miami. You can practically swim there. And you know, it has always been this destination with this mystique. They still think they're going to see Hemingway having a drink over there at La Bodeguita. So how do you see that happening? What do you see happening there as tourism keeps increasing and people don't go to the other destinations? Yes.
The return of Cuba as a destination for American tourists has both negative and positive effects. In the short run, it's a new destination. It's going to attract a lot of investment and tourists there. And that could divert particularly tourists from the nearest islands to Cuba, such as the Bahamas, Dominican Republic. But it could affect the entire Caribbean. However, the tourist industry has grown steadily each year globally and in the Caribbean, even in the wake of the global financial crisis. So there is room to accommodate further growth. What is important for the Caribbean is to do the following. One, to maintain the freshness of the tourism product and its international competitiveness in price and quality. And secondly, to look for the possibility of multiple destination tourism. That is, sometime in Cuba, sometime in the rest of the Caribbean, find collaborative ways. Lastly, the Caribbean has tremendous tourism expertise and management which it can offer to Cuba in building Cuban tourism. One of the essential things is to ensure that as airlift comes from new markets like China, that the Caribbean also make sure that it is competitive with the new destinations. For example, direct flights from China to Cuba, but not yet to the rest of the Caribbean. So the Caribbean faces competition, but it's an industry in the Caribbean which has shown an ability to remain internationally competitive and attractive. I have no doubt that the industry will continue to grow, but it needs to up its game because of the new competition.
I don't have a lot to add to Ambassador Bernal's point. International tourism grew by 4% in 2015. Global trade grew by 2.8%. So what we do know is that the tourism market continues to expand, and the Caribbean's growth has been positive for a while now. So I think on the whole, the Caribbean is doing well. To the point, Cuba does present a little bit of a challenge, and there have been a number of studies done. The Caribbean Hotel and Tourism did do a study on the disruption that Cuba could cause. But one of the points that there is that the U.S. is the only country that has the embargo on Cuba, and other countries have been traveling to Cuba without any interference for ever, I guess, and so that market is safe. You've got the Canadians, the Europeans, to Ambassador Bernal's point, the emerging Chinese and Asian market coming into the Caribbean. So I think it is both a challenge and an opportunity. But I think as long as the Caribbean does work on its competitive issues, and does remain able to compete with Cuba on cost and quality, they should be okay.
Thank you.
Well, as you can see, on a day when session's ending, people are leaving town, we had committee members come, even unexpected to the chairman. That shows the importance that the Caribbean region is to our subcommittee, to Congress as a whole, and I think to the government. We're going to continue delving into these issues and figuring out ways that we can engage more, especially in light of Venezuela, as we talked about, and what may or may not happen with Petrocaribe. I think there's great opportunity. I talk about jobs, energy, and the Founding Fathers all the time. I think there's opportunity in jobs, opportunity in energy, and opportunity for hemispheric engagement for the country, and especially in this region. So witnesses are reminded there may be other questions that are submitted. We ask you to respond to those. We'll leave the record open for 10 days. And we want to thank you, Eric, Sally, Ambassador. Thanks for coming, and I look forward to the continuing conversation. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes, sir.
It would be remiss of us if we didn't place on record our appreciation to you for your leadership and chairing of the committee, and for convening this session to give us an opportunity to share some views with you. And we place on record our appreciation. It would be remiss of us.
Well, let's put the attention where it's directed. My ranking member wanted to focus on this issue, and I'm glad he did. We were welcomed happy to accommodate him, and I appreciate that. I kind of directed my focus toward the region, and I'm super glad that he did. So we look forward to seeing you in September after this break, and hope everyone has a good break as well. And with that, the committee will stand adjourned.